Loved talking to this guy all season long, and in his usual Monday spot here on the Rich Eisen Show, fresh off the Super Bowl 57, is a man who won the Super Bowl as a Philadelphia Eagle, one of his 2 championships. The other one came in a Super Bowl that was prior to last night, the only Super Bowl in which a team that trailed by 10 or more points at halftime actually came back to win. Those teams are now trailing by 10 or more points at halftime, 2-26 in the history of the Super Bowl. Chris Long, the host of Green Light Podcast, back here on the program. How you doing, Chris?
What's up, Rich? Do you take any naps, man? Maybe it's a nap day.
I don't nap all that well, and if I do, it's like 10 minutes and done. That's it.
Man, you're missing out. You're missing out. As you can hear from my voice, I spent the week in Phoenix as well.
Fantastic. Let's jump into it, Chris Long. Your opinion of Super Bowl 57 overall. What do you got for me on that?
Man, there was a moment, Rich, in the fourth quarter where I thought to myself, this is the greatest Super Bowl of all time, right? And the way it ended was certainly hard to stomach, especially for Eagles fans. And, you know, for people just objectively watching the game, I know initially, you know, my reaction was maybe I didn't see an angle. Maybe Greg Olsen didn't see an angle because he had a hand in talking me into being outraged as I drove home. And, you know, I still think relative to the way the rest of the game was called, you know, that penalty was a bit ticky-tack. But by the letter of the law and certainly seeing the freeze frame of the jersey being pulled, and more than anything, hearing James Bradberry talking in detail about, hey, you know, like, I gave it a tug to try to gain momentum, to pull myself back out to run with the wheel route. You know, it's not just the turning of was it Juju, but it's also, and they missed one on Juju earlier in the game. It's the using him to slingshot and catch up. And you know, a lot of people seem to be confused. You know, inside 5 yards, you got pass interference rules, and then you have, you know, uncatchable balls. But none of that applied to this play. And having heard, you know, James Bradberry, who deserves a lot of credit for having the fortitude to admit that, and then Nick Sirianni, who lost with class and said, hey, that's not the reason we lost the game. Jason Kelce, the whole thing. It made it a little bit easier to stomach, and it was still one of the greatest Super Bowls of all time. And I think the offensive lines deserve a lot of credit for that because both quarterbacks were clean, and you were able to see them work their magic. I mean, they were both sensational. Jalen Hurts wins that game. He's the MVP. So it was a great game, but in the end, the two things that I worried about kind of played out. It was Patrick Mahomes' greatness, and it was Andy Reid, not only with a bye week, but with 30 minutes to kind of come up with the first 15 and a game plan for the second half, and to come out there and run the football and protect Mahomes. Obviously, the stuff with the motion at the end of the game, which I'm sure we'll talk about, was huge. Andy Heck deserves a lot of credit. He's the run game coordinator in Kansas City. He was the coach that, you know, I've known him since he recruited me at UVA. He coached my brother Kyle. He's a hell of a coach. They won that thing up front.
They did, and you know, I just mentioned at the end of our first hour the stat that hardly anybody's talking about that tells the full story is Hassan Reddick, who was a wrecking machine against San Francisco and has been the leader of a full unit wrecking machine on defense. 1 tackle, no sacks. They didn't sack Mahomes last night. In the second half, he was a bit of a sitting duck. And so you mentioned the motions and the plays and the fact that Tony's wide open and Sky Moore is wide open, and Juju Smith was running a similar route that he got held on at the end of the game. What did you see that Reid and Bieniemy and everyone on offense was able to dial up in the second half to have a different effect, Chris?
Well, they continue to run the ball. I mean, they stretched edges. They stressed the front with that. I mean, like, the entire game, I thought they deserve a lot of credit, for getting the ball out. I mean, like, you know, anytime you see a great rusher like that, and Andrew Wiley deserves a lot of credit. I thought that was a mismatch. He proved otherwise. I mean, he hung in there. He did a great job at the top of the rush in trying to push Reddick by. He kind of turned a lot of these pass sets into run blocks at the top of the rush and just tried to carve him out of there. You know, I think this was the quickest they had gotten the ball out in a while. They had a ton of play. Over 56% of their pass plays were under 2.5 seconds. So that shot clock was quick for the rushers, and when it wasn't, they maxed up. They did play action. They chipped Son Reddick a ton. And then also the surface. I mean, a lot of people are complaining about the call affecting the game. I think the surface affected the way the game played out. I'm not saying it would have necessarily benefited the Eagles, but, these rushers kind of have to change the way they rush a little bit. People were slipping early in the game. I mean, Willie Gay is trying to pick up Devontae Smith on a crosser earlier. He sticks his foot in the ground, and he's slipping, and you can kind of tell the rushers are slipping. Kelce's slipping, trying to celebrate a touchdown. I thought they did a really nice job in the screen game as well. Little things like Creed Humphrey blocking up Jordan Davis on the decisive scramble of the game. Jordan's the balance-up guy, and he's given up 100 pounds to Jordan Davis, but he's able to stay on him, and Mahomes is able to, squeak out and run into the red zone there and effectively ice the game. So the front deserves a lot of credit, but what they do is, they game plan, and they go back to week 4, and, I think it was Kadarius Toney's first touchdown as a Chief. Or there was a play no, it wasn't. No, actually, so they ran jet sweep with Kadarius Toney on his first touchdown, so that helped set it up. But then also week 4, I think they had pointed to a play when the Eagles played the Jaguars, and Jamal Agnew had run a similar play with a different result, and they saw the way that they were kind of like shifting their secondary responsibilities. I think it's called a banjo. I used to hear guys scream it all the time in the red zone and places like that behind me. But basically, when these guys go in motion, as you saw with Darius Slay, he's going to replace the safety, and the safety is going to run to out leverage the guy who's in motion in case of jet sweep or, he's got to pick him up in coverage. Well, Slay kind of reset that play, and obviously the motion comes right back out. And it's a touchdown. And the unforgivable part is it happens again the very next possession after the Toney return, which was set up by a bad special teams play, low line drive kick, and a great return. And ironically, if you're a Giant fan, maybe it's not such a bad draft pick after all because the guy beat the Eagles, right? It was a lot of, hey, we're going to do what we do. We've changed the offensive line a great deal in a calendar year over the course of a year or two. You go into this game and you're like, you'd hate to see it be a repeat of the Bucs game in the Super Bowl, and it wasn't, and then some, because they're able to run these gap scheme runs. They've got Pacheco, and I thought, look at the two guys that scored the touchdowns at the end of the game. They weren't on this roster a calendar year ago, yeah. Toney, Sky Moore. So, Sky Moore had a big punt return in the AFC Championship. You also had Pacheco playing a huge role. So, Tyreek Hill leaves. Juju has a big drive where he's got 3-4 catches. He ended up with 6 or 7 catches. MVS had a huge AFC Championship. They had a lot of guys step up that haven't been a part of this ride for them. And here they are again as world champions and Patrick Mahomes in 5 years. I mean, now I got to put him on, he's unquestionably a top 5 quarterback of all time when you look at the resume and what you see on tape. I mean, he's just, to me, he's in that conversation already with a long time to go.
Well, before we get a little bit more into Mahomes, I do want to spend a couple minutes with you, Chris Long, about what Steve Spagnuolo did. It just seemed that there was a shift defensively for the Chiefs in the second half as well. What did you see he was doing that, that was a huge 3-and-out for the Eagles after the Toney touchdown? And that led to the Toney return and the Sky Moore touchdown you just referred to. They also bowed up in the red zone after they scored a touchdown to start the second half and forced the Eagles to just go for 3. What did you see out of Spagnuolo?
Well, he was selective about when he brought pressure, and I thought that was smart. And I thought, short of the Snead play where he kind of dropped Devontae Smith in coverage. And another thing that the Eagles did a good job of on the positive side, they did a good job with Chris Jones. And that was a play where I talked about after the AFC Championship, when Chris Jones is not on the field, you got to take shots, and they did. But, yeah, the red zone was a huge deal, right, on both sides of the ball, because the Eagles, who are one of the better red zone teams in the league, The Chiefs are going to go 100%, if not for that game-winning field goal. So on the other side of things, you mentioned that 3-and-out. You mentioned the low red zone, or the red zone stop that they had. This was the kind of game where if you're sitting there on defense, I want to credit Spags and the Chiefs defense, but it's really about, the bar for success is pretty low. After you saw these first couple possessions of the game, all you have to do is get a stop, right? It kind of came down to whoever's going to get a stop at some point, because the math just wouldn't add up. And, for the Eagles, I think the difference was, on our 2018 Super Bowl against the Patriots, we were able to make one big defensive play. It's a very similar game, when you look at it. I think we won that one 41-33 or something. This team gave up 35 points. We didn't play great in that Super Bowl defensively, but the one thing that we were able to do was get one big play. And I thought what was different in this game was, what was similar was Tom Brady got the ball out pretty quick in our Super Bowl, as you could see in those numbers. Patrick Mahomes got the ball out as well, and they leaned heavily on 7-man protection when they had to, and they chipped out. So, kind of an around-the-world thing here to answer your question, but I think Spags deserves credit. I think the bar for success was pretty low, because all you had to do was get a stop or two in that second half, and they did that, and they created one big turnover. They didn't create it necessarily because Jalen just dropped the ball, but they had Nick Bolton up in a mug look, and they go to run that QB draw, and he's right there to disrupt Jalen Hurts and make him think, and he drops the ball, and it's 7. And for a guy who played such a perfect game, that's the one big mistake. And for the Eagles, they weren't able to get those turnovers.
Chris Long here on the Rich Eisen Show. Couple more minutes left with the 2-time Super Bowl champion. You mentioned Mahomes moments ago. I want to give you the floor on him, a little preview of what I'm going to say later on, because I haven't hit him specifically yet. Because I think, Chris, when it's all said and done and we look back, we'll look at Super Bowl 57 as his big moment becoming an all-time great. I truly believe it. It's the first Super Bowl in which he's played extremely well. It's the Super Bowl that made him a multiple winner. He's the first guy since Kurt Warner, ending a streak of 9 straight MVPs of the league, to play in the Super Bowl, to actually win it, and ended a streak of that losing streak, and for him to do it in the first Super Bowl that Tom Brady is retired officially for good, I think we're going to look at him as the guy of the league for the rest of his career because of last night. Now I give you the floor on that, Chris.
Yeah, just the guy is, he is really, this run, it's like folklore, man. People are going to remember the ankle thing. Jacksonville game, you thought maybe this was it for them. He goes down and he's really hurting, and Henny enters the game, and you're just thinking, man, what a shame, what bad luck for him. But then he comes out in the AFC Championship game. There was a stretch in the second half there where they needed his magic, and I truly believe it was him and Chris Jones willing that team to win. And then the Super Bowl, obviously, going out there and really he looked good scrambling until he got clipped there, I think, by T.J. Edwards, and at that point you're wondering, damn, did it happen again? Are we going to see Henny? He looked really bad. But then coming out in the second half, that kind of Mahomes magic where you're like, oh, shoot, if you're an Eagles fan, he's walking pretty good out of the tunnel. And that first drive, I'll have this play kind of burned into my brain, him scrambling with a stiff arm on Jordan Davis just to keep him off him long enough to deliver that ball to Travis Kelce. And it's a low catch.
Yep.
It's a really tough catch, and it just encapsulates, their greatness. It's like when they absolutely need to make a play, when everything seems like it's broken down, those two have been able to find each other in huge situations. And so, yeah, I think Mahomes is the face of the sport, and it's ironic because a couple weeks ago, it felt like we were doing this whole is Joe Burrow now the face of the sport conversation, but ultimately it comes down to these last games. And, what's scary to think about is had he had a healthy offensive line against the Bucs, maybe we're talking about 3 championships and 3 for 3 and that sort of thing. So Patrick Mahomes deserves a great deal of credit. And I also you couldn't have a better guy be the face of the sport. He's just such a charismatic, true to himself, tough, easy to rally around guy who's just a total gamer. And his competitive nature, when people talk about Michael Jordan, right, you hear the folklore, you hear about he don't like to lose in anything. He's just so competitive. When Kyle went to play for the Chiefs, my brother, he talked about, Patrick Mahomes in the same light, whether it was a drill, whether they were out playing golf, whether it was Flip Cup. This guy wants to win every single thing that he takes on, and we there's a lot of hyperbole in sports. Killer instinct, competitiveness. This guy's the ultimate competitor. He's truly in that class, and he's a great face for the league.
Last one for you, Chris Long. Let's just linger a bit on Hurts. What a dynamite player! What an electric player he is. He is him too, man. I mean, he is terrific. And, under the lights and the pressure, he crushed it. He absolutely crushed it. And, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith are a terrific duo. I sure hope Kelce sticks around, but it's easy for me to say. I'm just assuming what he puts in to play at this level and be who he still is, future Hall of Famer. It's a lot. But what do you say to Eagles fans about the future here? Because their coaching staff might be poached a bit in the next 24, 48. But what do you make of this, Chris?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's kind of the end of an era, but the show goes on in a way, because I feel like they're set at quarterback, right? Jalen Hurts was amazing. The stuff that he did with his legs and his arm, but in the red zone, short yardage, the 2-point conversion, I thought was just totally summed up what this guy's about, what this team was about, what he was about all year long. And I really wish we would have gotten to see him with 1:20 left on the clock trying to tie the game, but it didn't go that way. The Eagles have to, they have to contend with 10 free agent starters. You mentioned Jason Kelce, what's going to happen with Fletcher Cox. There's this group of guys that were on that 17 team that are really special. They're going to forever go down in history as some of the most important people in Philly sports history, whether it's Brandon Graham, Fletcher Cox, Lane Johnson, Jason Kelce. That core group, I just can't wrap my head around it. For the last 4 or 5 years, since I've been out of the game podcast and doing this type of stuff, they've been grinding to get back where we were in 2017 through 2019 to 2020, through, the Carson stuff, through the whole thing. And to think that they were able to get back here, I'm trying to think the way Kelce would think. It's got to be a long, tiring run. And I hope that he doesn't make any rash decisions. I hope that nobody makes any rash decisions over the next day or two, because I can speak from experience. The only reason I came back in 2018 was the FOMO. Just in case this team is back in this thing, I wouldn't be able to live with myself for the rest of my life if I missed out on that thing. So I think Kelce has got a lot to think about. I think the team has a lot to think about. Shane Steichen is the Colts' next head coach. Jonathan Gannon's going to be interviewing for positions, but I think there were some really great offensive minds that worked with Jalen Hurts under Shane Steichen that are going to be just fine. And there's a lot of guys in that building that you don't know their names that are going to rise through the ranks and be good coaches for that football team. So I think it's just mainly about the 10 free agents. I think it's about roster construction. I think it's about, hey, do we pay C.J. Gardner-Johnson? We obviously have to pay Jalen Hurts and that sort of thing. Howie Roseman's been a whiz at this. I think they'll be back. They have a lot to be proud of this year. They were a great football team. They just came up short.
Brother, you are the best. Seriously, I love talking to you every single week. It's been an amazing season. I can't thank you enough for doing it, and I hope you'll do this any time and next season and beyond.
Hey, I'll be on anytime you want. This has been fun, man.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, Rich. You're the best.
You too.
And your crew is awesome, so thank you all too.
We feel the same way. Who's on the pod this week? What do you got? What's your Super Bowl pod? What do you got? Anybody
else? I got Joe Montana coming on. So I got Wednesday. We'll have a good bit of time with Joe Montana, so check that out.
I'd love it.
On the Greenlight Pod. We had a great interview with Brian Dawkins in Phoenix, and he's just such a great guy. I mean, he's just so much energy. God drove an hour to our Airbnb round trip to sit down for a while.
Okay.
And so, check that out. Joe Montana coming up this week. Couple Hall of Famers. So,
fantastic. Greenlight with Chris Long. You're the best, man. We'll chat again soon.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you. The great Chris Long. Love talking to him. Insight, funny, intelligent. Just love it. All of it. Catch the Rich Eisen Show every single day on the Roku channel, 12 to 3 Eastern, for free.